You're dressed in layers upon layers petticoats, a tightly laced corset, and a giant hoop skirt so wide it could shelter a small family. You're at a grand royal ball, sipping tea, making polite conversation with lords and ladies. Then suddenly, nature calls. Now what? How do you even reach under all that fabric? Where do you go? And more importantly, how did women even deal with periods in these outfits? Welcome to the Victorian era, an age of opulence, elegance, and a staggering lack of basic hygiene. During Queen Victoria's reign, women were expected to be the very image of grace and modesty. Their fashion reflected it. Towering hairstyles, delicate gloves, and those famous Crinolines, huge structured petticoats that made their skirts balloon out like circus tents. Queen Victoria herself was a trendsetter of this elaborate style, but beneath the glamour and silk, it was a nightmare no one talks about. There were no flush toilets, running water in most homes, and modern sewer systems were still decades away. In fact, in many parts of Europe, the concept of a private indoor bathroom simply didn't exist. So, when nature called, you went wherever you could. Behind a tree, in a chamber pot under your bed, or even in a discreet corner of a ballroom if you had to. Yes, really, that old expression, don't have a pot to piss in. That wasn't just colorful language, it came from the harsh truth of Victorian poverty. Many homes didn't even have a simple pot for basic needs. Those who did often emptied them out the window, right into the street. Imagine walking through London, dodging not just horse manure but also, well, you get the idea. And menstruation, that's a whole other chapter of suffering. Disposable pads didn't exist. Tampons, not even a concept yet. Women relied on rags, cloths, or even sponges, all reused, washed in secret, and carried in silence. There was no such thing as open conversation about periods. It was considered unclean, inappropriate, even shameful. The irony: Victorian society was obsessed with purity and morality, yet the very bodies of women were wrapped in layers of pain, discomfort, and silence. So the next time someone romanticizes the good old days, remember this: behind every elegant Victorian lady was a daily struggle to stay clean, stay composed, and survive a world that gave them beauty but not dignity. The pot in the phrase, not a pot to piss in, wasn't a metaphor. It was real. It referred to the chamber pot, a humble, ceramic or metal bowl placed discreetly under the bed, used for one very human purpose: collecting urine and feces. If you didn't own one, your only option was to step outside, praying for privacy, hoping you didn't get caught, or worse. And what about the streets? They weren't just dirty, they were dangerous. Victorians routinely tossed the contents of their chamber pots right out the window, straight onto the cobblestones below. And so, in cities like London, you didn't just look up for anklets. You looked up for, well, falling human waste. High-heeled shoes, umbrellas. They weren't just about fashion. They were armor survival gear in cities where the sky might rain filth. In Britain, the chamber pot was affectionately known as a jerry, and it was a household essential. Each came with a lid, but that lid wasn't a courtesy. It was a warning: full, proceed at your own risk. Now, you might think the wealthy avoided all this, that noble homes, palaces, and royal estates had elegant bathrooms. But don't be fooled. Even in the grand homes of the elite, chamber pots were everywhere, just carefully hidden. They were tucked away in ornate cabinets, disguised in decorative furniture, or even built into wooden chairs with secret compartments. Servants scurried through the halls multiple times a day, checking and emptying the pots quietly, because no matter how rich you were, you couldn't escape the call of nature. If you were really fortunate, your bathroom might be a private wooden bench with a pot underneath, a seat of luxury, over a bowl of waste. But this raises one critical question: where did it all go? Enter the garderobe, a grim holdover from medieval architecture. This was an early toilet, built into the upper floors of castles and mansions, often jutting out precariously over an alley or the street. Waste would drop down a shaft, sometimes directly into rivers, sometimes into cesspits, and often just onto the street below. The smell, unimaginable. The sanitation, non-existent. And yet, this was daily life in the Victorian era, time of manners, marble halls, and perfume. Masking the rot underneath. Behind every parasol and petticoat, beneath the elegance and etiquette, was a city barely clinging to and the chamber pot, that silent, smelly object under the bed. It was the one thing everyone had in common. When it was time to empty the chamber pot, the answer was simple: open the window and toss. To avoid an accidental drenching of an unfortunate passerby, a warning would ring out: Gardello, a shout of watch out for the water. In French, a polite reminder that something decidedly impolite was about to fall from above. And fall it did. The streets and homes were overwhelmed by waste. The stench was unbearable, but it was a daily reality. In fact, entire cities were practically drowned in their own filth. Some streets even had raised stone steps to allow pedestrians to leap over the flowing waste, dodging human refuse in a daily ritual of survival. But here's the real kicker: something you might find truly shocking. During the Napoleonic Wars and the English Civil War, government agents would go door to door collecting chamber pot contents. Why? Because urine, your PI, was a key ingredient in making gunpowder. It was refined into saltpeter, a crucial substance for ammunition. So, while the masses were struggling to stay clean, their waste was fueling war. Your urine literally helped power battles across Europe. But let's shift focus to the fashion of the iconic Victorian dresses, those massive, weighty crinolines, petticoats, and overkirts that transformed women into walking architectural wonders. These garments were so voluminous, so layered, that undergarments like knickers were entirely unnecessary. The fabric swished, swirled, and flowed around women, creating an elegant spectacle that few would dare disrupt. And with all that fabric, no one noticed what wasn't underneath. Yes, you heard that right. For much of the Victorian era, ladies walked around without knickers. It wasn't until later in the century, when the bell-shaped crinolines began catching gusts of wind and flipping women over in public, that modesty had to step in and provide a solution. The fashion world wasn't entirely prepared for the consequences of the wind, and society began to whisper, perhaps it's time for drawers. But these weren't the dainty, lace-edged undergarments you might imagine. No, what society needed were actual drawers full-length, heavy cotton garments designed to cover the lower half of the body. No frills, no lace. Just functional modesty. Modesty of the Victorian woman was more about covering up the awkward realities of her day-to-day life. Fabrics so thick, they might as well have been armor. And the drawers. Just another layer to add to the maze of fabric, all meant to conceal more than just the body but the daily struggle to maintain appearances. The early Victorian underwear now, that's a topic you don't hear about in history. Class, crotchless drawers. Yes, you read that right. They were essentially two pant legs connected only at the waist, with a split down the middle, right where it mattered most. Why? Because ladies weren't about to lift 20 pounds of petticoats, shifts, and skirts every time nature called. These open crotch drawers were practical, designed to make the unavoidable task of using a chamber pot slightly less cumbersome when a woman needed to relieve herself. The overlapping flaps of cottonwood part, just like curtains on a stage, offering just enough coverage, and no, this wasn't for modesty, it was about function. A quick squat, and the mission was accomplished discreetly and without exposing the entire room to what was happening under all that fabric. You see, chamber pots for women weren't the standard round shape that men used. They were oval, with scooped-in sides, carefully designed to fit snugly between a woman's thighs. A lady would simply position the pot beneath her skirts. No need for awkward squatting or lifting skirts up to her chin. It was all about subtlety. A quick maneuver under the layers of fabric, and done right. No one in the room would even know what had just happened. At fancy balls or social gatherings, there were even entire retiring rooms set aside just for this. Inside, several chamber pots stood ready, and like nurses on a battlefield, maids were on standby. One maid would carefully lift the layers of the lady's gown, while another would position the chamber pot underneath her. Afterward, it was a quick wipe with a damp cloth, and the lady would be back on her feet, re-entering the ballroom as if nothing had happened. For the elite, this was an elegant system. But not every woman had that luxury. For many, the process was simpler and far rougher. The chamber pot sat on the floor. Skirts were lifted, a quick squat, and then clean up. What did they clean up with? Well, the options were a bit more rustic. Cold newspapers, leaves, or even corn cobs. Yes, corn cobs. The kind you'd use to make cornmeal for dinner. Now being used for something a bit more, well, unrefined. But don't worry, we'll dive into those charming details in another section. Let's just say the Victorian era's idea of hygiene didn't always live up to the beauty they so carefully tried to present. At the very base of a Victorian woman's wardrobe was the linen shift-soft, washable, and essential. It was changed often, sometimes daily, sometimes with each new outfit, as part of an ongoing battle for cleanliness. But it wasn't just the women in these heavy layers dealing with the hygiene struggles. The maids and servants, who wore far fewer layers, also lived without the luxury of elaborate gowns or private retiring rooms. Privacy in the Victorian world was a luxury few even considered, especially when it came to using the toilet. In poorer homes, families would relieve themselves in front of each other, with no separate water closets, no locked doors. It was just the chamber pot, the floor, or the yard. And at high society events, well, gentlemen would simply stroll into the garden and do their business among the roses. Now, let's get to the question no one dares ask, but everyone wonders about: how did the Victorians wipe their bottoms? Brace yourself. One of the most popular tools of the early Victorian era was the dried corn cob. Yes, you heard that right, corn on the cob, minus the kernels. It was rotated like a crude roller brush, working to, well, clean the area. If that sounds primitive, it's because these weren't delicate instruments. They were reused, cleaned only occasionally, if at all. And the corn cob wasn't the only option. Another favorite was the sea sponge on a stick. After each use, it was dipped into a communal bucket filled with either salt water or vinegar and then used again, and again, and again. This wasn't just a Victorian oddity. Early humans wiped with whatever they had: rocks, dirt, clay, the very earth itself. Comfort. That wasn't the point. Cleanliness. Well, that's debatable. It was simply about doing what had to be done, and whatever was available. But there were plenty of other items that found their way to the rear. Leaves, straw, and yes, seashells. Imagine the poor soul who found that in their garden. You'd probably rather go without, right? But for Victorians, it was just part of life. And for the upper class, the communal sponge was the ultimate test of civility, ever mind the fact that it had been used by countless others before you. This was the stark, gritty truth of Victorian hygiene. Behind all the elegance, the puffy dresses, the chandeliers, there was a very real, very unglamorous side to life in the 19th century. You can probably imagine how well that went. As paper became more common, and slightly more affordable, started turning to printed materials for more than just reading. Newspapers, catalogs, even magazines became part of a woman's daily life. And if you've ever wondered what happened to last month's issue of the Times, it might have ended up in the chamber pot. Toilet paper, as we know it today, didn't even begin to take shape until the late 1800s, when patents for toilet paper began to appear. But it wasn't until the early 1900s that it was mass-produced into soft, rolled sheets like the modern version we use today. Before that, let's just say a trip to the bathroom wasn't the refreshing experience we now take for granted. It was a gritty, makeshift affair, more about survival than comfort. Now let's get to something even more fascinating or horrifying, depending on how you look at it. How did Victorian women manage menstruation with all those mountains of fabric and the steel-caged crinolines? Well, first, it's important to know that Victorian women had fewer periods than women do today. But why? There were three main reasons. Puberty started around the same time as now, between the ages of 12 and 14. Menopause often came early, sometimes in a woman's mid-30s. Poor nutrition and relentless physical labor meant that many women had low body fat, which often led to irregular cycles. So, fewer periods. Yes, but no periods. Absolutely not. When that time of the month came, Victorian women faced it without a single pad, tampon, or any disposable product we take for granted today. They had to get resourceful. Instead of tight-fitting underwear, women wore a basic undergarment, a linen, shift-along, washable layer that protected their expensive dresses from body oils and stains. But when menstruation arrived, the shift wasn't enough. They turned to something called the tea bandage. Picture it like a primitive bikini bottom tied at the waist and secured with a strip of cloth that ran between the legs. Inside, it was packed with absorbent rags. But here's the kicker: if the woman was too poor to afford cloth, she'd improvise. Moss, sheep's wool, even layers of grass, whatever she could find that would soak up the blood. And those rags, they didn't just disappear. They were washed and reused often, over and over again. Can you imagine the smell of damp, reused cloth in a house with no indoor plumbing? This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a test of endurance, of a woman's ability to keep up appearances, while enduring a process most women today would never dream of. In the Victorian world, cleanliness was a luxury few could afford, especially for women. But what's even more astonishing is that, despite all the struggles, they still managed to maintain the image of grace, elegance, and decorum while battling the grim realities of daily life. They were washed, dried, and used again and again, month after month. Victorian women had no choice. Their tea bandages, those primitive, cloth-packed undergarments, were essential, and they had to change them anywhere from 12 to 20 times a day. Depending on the flow, it was exhausting, uncomfortable, and utterly necessary. On lighter days, some women resorted to wearing thicker petticoats, hoping the extra layers of fabric would catch what needed catching. But no matter how much they tried to manage, menstruation wasn't something that could be ignored. As the Victorian era progressed, split-crotch drawers became more common, but they didn't offer any real protection. These garments were designed with bathroom visits in mind, not for dealing with the mess of menstruation. The idea was convenience, not comfort or sanitation. And through all of this, women were expected to remain graceful, poised, and above all silent about what they were enduring. Pain, blood, odor, it all had to be hidden beneath layers of silk, lace, and iron discipline. No one dared to talk about it, but every woman lived it. Now, let's talk about the other monumental task that comes with being wrapped in all those layers: laundry. How did Victorians wash those massive floor-sweeping dresses, the ones with trains, lace ruffles, and yards of velvet? Well, they didn't exactly wash them the way we would today. Victorian laundry was an ordeal, physically grueling: water hauling, soap scrubbing, and backbreaking. And for many households, it was only done twice a year, during what was grimly known as the Great Wash. Imagine waiting 6 months to clean your clothes. That wasn't laziness, that was survival. Water and soap were dangerous, too risky for fine fabrics. Washing with water could ruin delicate silks, velvet, or lace. So, instead of soaking their dresses in a tub of water, women would sprinkle them with talcum powder. then brush off the dust along with the odor of sweat and skin. It didn't remove the smell, it just covered it up. And that was good enough. When a dress wasn't being worn, it wasn't tossed in a laundry basket. No, it was carefully folded and stored in cedar-lined trunks or closets, designed to keep out moths and insects. These dresses were precious, and keeping them safe from damage meant doing everything possible to preserve them, even if it meant living with their less than fresh scent. The Victorian idea of hygiene and cleanliness was in many ways a battle against the inevitable. The things we take for granted, like fresh, clean clothes and sanitary periods, were luxuries that Victorians could only dream of. But through it all, women persevered, hiding their discomfort, their struggles, and their pain under layers of fabric, grace, and societal expectations. These garments were treasures, not just clothing, but works of craftsmanship, sewn with astonishing skill, intricate detail, and the finest materials available. And yet, despite their beauty, these gowns were worn until they were threadbare or until the stench was so overpowering, it practically screamed before you even entered the room. But beneath those elaborate gowns, hidden from view, was the real shield against filth, layers upon layers of washable undergarments. Shifts, schmezzes, petticoats, crinolines, they absorbed the sweat, the grime, and the body oils, protecting the valuable outerwear. These undergarments could be scrubbed by hand, often in boiling water, with harsh soap, sometimes by overworked maids or larrikins, grubbing away the day's dirt, sweat, and smell. Victorian beauty came at a cost, and that cost was sweat, time, and most certainly, odor. Now here's the real question. If you had the chance, would you turn back the clock and live like this, layered in silk and soot, walking through sewage, brushing powder over body odor, and managing periods with moss and rags? Let us know in the comments below. Could you survive the grime for the sake of elegance, or would you gladly leave this era behind?